to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. And our purpose here is to foster dialogue about articles and book reviews that are published in our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, as well as a discussion, as we're doing now, of lectures that are given at our annual meeting. And in this program, we're absolutely delighted to have a special guest who gave a plenary talk at the ASA 2023 meeting in Toronto last month on the topic male, female, and intersex in the image of God. And so we're delighted to welcome Megan DeFranza. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for the invitation to be with you today.
It is great. And I see a number of names here that I know were attending the meeting, so they've heard you once and they're back. And I see a number of people who are not able to attend and are eager to be here. And so it's good to have you here. So as is our custom, we'd like to give our listeners a little bit of a background of who you are from a personal point of view, rather than the list of the academic credentials, which are impressive, but you've already heard as part of the lecture. So, Megan, I know you live in Beverly, Massachusetts, which is halfway between my house and the ASA office. So you're in good proximity, but I doubt you were born and raised there, or were you?
No, so my grandparents were traditional missionaries in what was then the Belgian Congo. And then my dad became a medical missionary and then was in the U.S. Public Health Service, focusing on dentistry for Native Americans. So always trying to bring medical care to folks with less access to good care. But that meant we moved around a little bit. So I was born in Tennessee and lived a couple different places, but spent most of my growing up years in junior high and high school in Ohio, Medina, Ohio. So that's what I claim. That's the short answer. Yeah.
So that's quite a background of your mission background at that point, right? So, where did you end up going to school then? That was all in Ohio?
No, I went to college at Toccoa Falls College, which is a little Christian college, Bible college in the northeast of Georgia, loosely affiliated with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And then I moved up here to north of Boston so I could go to Gordon Conwell Seminary, which I did.
I see.
Then I moved to Wisconsin so I could do my PhD in religious studies at Marquette University. And then we came back to Beverly because we really like it here.
Yeah, you liked it here. That's great. So what took you to Marquette?
My PhD program.
Right. So, I mean, was that a particular focal point for your topic, or did you choose your topic first and then go to Marquette, or did you
go to Marquette? Well, my topic goes back actually to really as a child. I grew up in a very conservative Christian church. And women didn't preach, women didn't teach, women didn't even pass the offering plate. But from a young age, I really wanted to serve the Lord with my life. And so, in high school, I was discipling people, president of Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and teaching. Then I go up to Bible college and I'm studying Greek and philosophy and theology and just soaking it up. And my academic advisor said, Megan, I think you should go and get your PhD in theology and come back and be the first female faculty person in our Bible and theology department. My Greek professor, on the other hand, credits himself with keeping women from being ordained in the Christian and Missionary Alliance denomination, told me I would be sinning, violating 1 Timothy 2, because I would be teaching theology to adult men in college. I was 20.
Oh, no. So how did you overcome that one?
I went to seminary.
All right.
6 years.
You took care of that. Yeah. That's true.
I wanted to know, how can I serve God and not accidentally sin, because I was born into a woman's body.
Right.
So that was in seminary, figured out that's where I came to an affirming view of women's ordination, though I've never felt called to the pastorate.
Right.
But the more I read in seminary on gender and theology, sex differences in theology, the more dissatisfied I was, both by what I was reading from conservative theologians and from what I was reading from liberal theologians. And so this was a thing in my head that I couldn't get out. So when I started at Marquette, my first semester, I wrote a paper. I was in an ethics and technology course, and I wrote a paper on the ethics of what was then called sex reassignment surgery. And that is where I found that the surgeries often used in gender affirming surgeries were actually developed as therapies for intersex children. And I knew that would be complicated. So I wrote one of those footnotes that we write as academics and say, the ethical application of these technologies to intersex children is beyond the scope of this paper. And then I went on to talk about, the trans conversation, and I was still very traditionalist. I was like, okay, Adam and Eve, the fall, redemption, sanctification, heaven, healing, and and saw that, believed that trans people needed healing and that was not God's design. And so that was one of the first papers I wrote when I was in my doctoral studies. Then when I was trying to find a dissertation topic, I knew that I actually came across Dr. Bauma's paper that he wrote with Heather Lloyd. I think I might have mentioned that in the talk.
Yes,
asking a theologian to please write something useful for the biologists and psychologists working on intersex. And so
yes, I think that work, if I believe, was in the annual meeting in 2006 that Bud and Heather started publicly talking about that. So there's been occasional discussion of this topic, but really coming out now. So that thesis topic is the essence of what your lecture has been?
That dissertation became this book, Sex Difference in Christian Theology. And so then teaching and talking about that has been where my career has gone. Eventually, I've been brought back into conversations on sexual ethics, particularly around homosexuality, and now the transgender conversation. So it's been a progression through those topics. I prayed all through seminary that God would give me a dissertation topic that wouldn't just be to get letters behind my name so I could teach. I prayed that God would give me a dissertation topic that would serve the church. And now I tell people, be very careful what you pray for. Sometimes I wish I was a little less
You got that
useful.
one, didn't you? You're right. Yeah, you sure did. Okay, so so let's that's helpful to get your background a little bit, so we know where you're coming from, and we've got a lot to talk about. So let's move into the content of it. So I think as you requested here, you've got about a 6-minute video clip on which you'd like to introduce this. Tell us about that, and then let's go ahead and
I'll say a little bit before that video, just to say about what is possible in a 45-minute lecture, which is what I was given at the annual meeting, and what is possible in an hour and a half conversation here. We cannot talk about everything. And I've seen comments, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you talk about that? And some of it is because I wasn't asked to talk about those things, and because there wasn't time. There was barely enough time to cover the things that I did. Anyone who says this topic is easy is selling something. It's complex, which is why we're not going to solve it today. But I hope we can build a good foundation for constructive conversation. So I thought about showing you a clip from the documentary from Dr. Jeff Campbell, who is a pediatric urologist and the head of the DSD clinic at Colorado Children's Hospital. In our movie, he talks about how he went to one of the support group meetings, intersex support group meetings, so he could learn better the medicine of working with people with differences of sex development. And he said the stories that he heard completely transformed him, shook him, and really brought about changes in the way they now take care of their patients. But rather than show you him talk about the power of stories, I'm going to show you a clip of one story from the film.
Why do I love my wife? Because she's a godly Christian woman. She loves to pray. She loves her husband. She cares for the people who have been pushed away.
I was born in the early 1950s. There was an M on my original birth certificate. I knew I wasn't a girl, but I also knew I wasn't a boy. But I was sick enough and frail enough that my parents worried about losing me. My parents encouraged curiosity and imagination and reading. So for a long time, I thought perhaps I had been left in place of a human boy as a changeling, part elf, because I was small and had ears that stuck out. My growth rate was very slow. At 2 years old, I weighed 18 pounds, which is tiny. When I was 9 years old, I was wearing my 6-year-old sister's clothes, given the opportunity, and never really punished for that. The first diagnosis I had was mixed gonadal dysgenesis. Some of my cells have a Y chromosome, and others don't. I was raised as a boy, though my parents were very liberal about gender. The very first thing that my parents said to me when I was born was, "You're going to college." So that was the one thing in my life I couldn't screw up, was school. So whatever would have to wait till after graduation. So I think that we had sort of an unspoken understanding that when I'm in high school and mom finds out that I'm wearing a dress somewhere, it's like, just never mind. Just never mind. You're going to college. I moved from a very supportive home to a boys' dorm. And if you're at all feminine, that's not a really good idea. If you don't have body hair or facial hair or muscles, they made it fairly clear that I was not one of them. One of the boys proved that he could do whatever he wanted to me, whenever. I ended up doing a lot of my studies in the stacks in the library because I was an honor student. But I managed to finish it in 3 years. And as soon as I was out of college, tried to address my gender issues. When I was a child, I thought that if I prayed diligently enough, if I tried hard enough, God would make me a boy, a real boy. And because he didn't, and because I knew I wasn't a real boy, I assumed that it was my failing, my moral failures that were keeping it from me. I held on to that fairly tightly all the way up until changing my status. And I waited until it was clear that I wasn't going to survive. I realized that if I didn't address these issues, I was going to be dead. Not suicidal so much as reckless. At 22, I had the sex development of a preteen boy. They offered testosterone, anabolic steroids, and exercise program to put weight on me and to, well, what he said was to make a stud of me. As soon as I turned down the testosterone, the doctor said, well, you wouldn't have any trouble being accepted as a girl. It wasn't so much that I had to be a girl as I wanted to have a life that didn't revolve around gender, that didn't involve people questioning my gender all the time. And that's what I got, because it was a surprise to me. Maybe it shouldn't have been, but I left my job working nominally as a man I got on an airplane as a woman and flew to San Francisco. And from the moment I got on the airplane, people were very nice to me and boys wanted to sleep with me. In a business office in San Francisco, I had a 3-stage process that was done as an outpatient. And one of the things they told me when they were talking about the surgeries was that if anything at all went wrong, none of the hospitals would take me in, because he did surgery primarily on transsexuals. And the local hospitals wouldn't have any of it. My problems didn't go away, they just became normal problems. I could go to work and people treated me as badly as they treat women in professions. But at least it wasn't being treated as the only outsider. When I first started living as a girl, my mother said that for the first time in my life, she knew I'd be all right.
In certain religious communities, as they are trying to figure out and think about people who are intersex in their communities, some people want to relegate these issues to like human brokenness or sin, not understanding the deeply kind of biological, psychological, and physiological issues that are involved here. I would implore religious communities to dig deep to help reframe some of these things and deal with the larger social structures and ways of relating to one another that could be more healthy and beneficial and promote human flourishing for all who are part of that community.
So that is my dear friend, Leanne. Elsewhere, she wrote that she wanted a life. She said, I wanted a life. I wanted peace. I wanted to live for Jesus rather than die by my own foolishness. I wanted to honor God with the hand he had dealt me. Most of all, I wanted people to leave me alone. The doctor said that with my face and demeanor, I wouldn't have any trouble being accepted as a girl. He was right. The bullying stopped. For more than 40 years, I've been able to focus on things other than my gender, to be a productive member of society, to live a fruitful life in joyful obedience to Christ. There are 2 parables that have really guided my work, 2 sections of scripture. The first is the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus talks about whatever you do for the least of these, you've done for me. And I see the least of these both as the vulnerable people in the world, as it is clear from the passage, and also literally, we're talking about a very small population of the human population. This is not everybody's experience. This is a small group of people. So I see it both in the vulnerability that Leanne was talking about, the bullying, the harassment, the assault, the refusal of health care, which we know is common for people who can't pass as male or female, whether or not they identify as trans or intersex. And also the parable of the Good Shepherd, where Jesus leaves the 99 and he goes after the one. The 99 were safe in the sheep pen, but he was not content ministering to the 99. He wanted to minister to every person. And those 2 parables have really been my guiding, the scriptures that have guided me in this work. Mm-hmm. So that's all I want to say before we do questions. Great.
All right, thank you very much. I think that sets the stage for a productive and meaningful dialogue. So we had given everyone a chance to submit questions in advance. We've got 4 of them. And first of all, we turn to Del Kuhn, who we can always trust to ask a question. Del, we'll go ahead and unmute your microphone. Dana, I think you've released those, right? Dana, you haven't done that yet. Okay, seems like we lost Dana here. Let me see if I can do that for you.
I think I'm unmuted.
There we go. Okay. Go ahead with your question, Del.
Megan, I appreciate your lecture and appreciate all
all the work that went into informing it. I'm also going to give you a thumbs up on this video clip this morning or this afternoon. And also thank you for taking the question, because what my concern is that the implications of saying there are many sexes in addition to male and female, especially since there's a wide variety of conditions which combined have a low incidence, it seems to me that we risk being drawn into an LGBTQIA activist agenda that goes beyond acceptance of individuals to include advocacy for sexual practices, transitioning, and political demands. And there's no bright line for us to say this far and no further. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if instead of redefining normal, would it be better to continue as we are to understand sex as binary, male, female, and it's then a medical question for someone whose biology doesn't fully align with these options, with the options that can range from surgical intervention like we do for cleft palates to simply leaving things alone like we do for slow-growing prostate cancer in older patients. So basically, I'm concerned that we think we're showing love and respect, but we're inadvertently signing on to morals that we're not going to be agreeing with later. So over to you for comments, please.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate your question so much. It's a really important question, and there are layers, so I'm going to just try to take it a piece at a time. You say one of the things I appreciate is how you put on the table one of the things that we don't talk about enough, and that is the role of fear in these conversations. Fear about sexual ethics. Intersex children are born into the world as babies, but our minds go straight to adult sexual activity, and so we have this concern about that. One of my intersex friends who has androgen insensitivity, so she has XY chromosomes and testes and normal levels of testosterone but can't absorb them, said, "Who is the opposite sex for me?" That's the problem. That's why people, I think, are so afraid of this conversation, is that for some people, the existence of bodies that have mixed sex characteristics make the concept of homosexuality seem shaky. And there was another member who asked why I didn't cover sexual ethics in my lecture, since it's such an important topic, and that was for reasons I've already discussed, which is because I was asked to talk about biology and sex difference as a theologian, and because there was hardly time to do that in 45 minutes. I do say a number of things about sexual ethics in my chapter in this book by Zondervan, 2 Views on Homosexuality, the Bible and the Church, which is really 4 views. Each chapter is excellently written and argued. And one of the best things about this book is actually the way that we could model constructive conversation around one of the most viscerally challenging topics facing the church today. So I'm very proud of that volume. So you're welcome to look at my comments there. Some people use sloppy arguments by saying, hey, sex and gender is a spectrum, therefore anything goes. But of course, as Christians who have a high view of scripture, we have to deal with the prohibition texts around those. And that's what I do in that book and in those chapters. One of the other problems I see is that Christians who use married Christian heterosexual sexual activity as this is good, and then sex outside of straight marriage is bad, or homosexual sex is bad. But the problem with using straight marriage as the ideal of good is it isn't nuanced enough, because there are many ways that sex within a straight marriage can be unholy and sinful. When people use sex as a bargaining chip for manipulating their spouse, when sex is forced on someone's spouse. Marital rape is now considered a crime. It wasn't for centuries. Married sex can be selfish, unkind, unloving, not concerned with the pleasure and consent of both partners. this kind of heterosexual married sex is sinful. So I want us to engage the conversation around sexual ethics at these more nuanced levels. What does godly sexuality look like? Rather than just say straight marriage. That's what godly sexuality looks like. So I'm wanting to invite people into a more nuanced conversation. And there are churches and denominations and parachurch organizations who are trying to guide us in those conversations. You said, instead of redefining normal, would it be better to continue to understand sex as binary? Intersex activists, I think I said this in my lecture, are not arguing for the elimination of the binary. They don't want a third sex listed on birth certificates unless the individual requests that as an adult, indicating their sex as intersex. I tend to get in trouble with people on the right and people on the left, because on the right, they're saying sex is binary. And on the left, they're saying sex is a spectrum. And I say, yes, it's both of those things. Sex is a binary and a spectrum. It's a spectrum, but it's not an evenly divided spectrum. There are two bell curves that are two binary, and there's an overlap. And what we're trying to figure out is, what do we do with that overlapped area? So that's my answer to the question about should we keep things as binary. My colleague at Boston University School of Theology, Wesley Wildman, uses the language non-strict dimorphism, which isn't really a catchy phrase. I don't expect it to catch on, but it more clearly talks about the nuanced reality that is. You then state, it's then a medical question if someone's body doesn't fully align with these, with options ranging from surgical intervention for cleft palate or leaving things alone like prostate cancer, which I think is a very reasonable proposal. With slow growing prostate cancer, the patient is informed of the risks of treatment options, and they're also told about the potential benefits. The problem is that, and then the patient makes a decision about what they want for their health care. The problem is with intersex folks, they are too young to consent, to understand the risks of surgical and hormonal interventions, so they're unable to give consent. And the same idea about informed consent applies to conversations around trans people, because politicians are inserting themselves into the conversations that really belong between a patient, their family, and the doctor, as they are informed about the potential risks and the potential benefits of those medical procedures. So it's about informed consent. You conclude, I'm worried that while we think we're showing love and respect, we're inadvertently signing on to morals we don't agree with. And again, I thank you for bringing up worry and fear, because we need more nuanced conversations around morals and sexual ethics, rather than letting our fears keep us from engaging these complicated conversations. So that's my best answer to your multifaceted question.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Megan. So let's move on. The second submitted question came from Stephen Willing. I see you over there. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Megan, thanks for your talk, and it was a very sweet video that you shared. Before I ask a question, lead into this, you talk about what we in medicine call iatrogenesis, and that's where the treatments actually lead to harm. It's something I know really quite personal from both ends. I had a son born with a tracheoesophageal fistula who suffered some horrendous surgical complications in his early treatment. And during my years of practice as an interventional neuroradiologist, I had some pretty bad outcomes that, kind of haunt me to this day. It's a small field, and we actually had an annual meeting where we got together and we each shared our complications. There you are standing in front of a room of 50 colleagues who can, throw tomatoes at you and tell you what a fool you were. So iatrogenesis is a big deal. So sorry about the digression there. I went off script, Randy. I hope I didn't scare you.
Just go ahead with your question. That's fine.
You poignantly describe the struggles of intersex people who do experience lifelong complications from surgical interventions. Yet this is exactly what some are advocating and doing to children with healthy bodies who experience gender confusion. Now we know that most children who present with gender dysphoria eventually desist and come to terms with their God-created bodies. So the questions here too. One, is the lesson here to leave nature alone? And second, what is our moral obligation in protecting from harm those children who might have desisted but are rushed into a treatment regimen that leaves them much worse off in the long run?
I'm so glad you asked this because it's such an important question. So thank you for that. First, the big difference between operating on an infant and a toddler or operating on an adult body or an adolescent body that is almost fully grown is the scar tissue on teeny tiny babies that doesn't stretch is not going to allow that child to grow. And it's going to cause many more complications. As an adult, you're dealing with the size of the genitals probably as they will be. And so there's a big difference in the implications of cutting into that genital tissue at such an early age. We're not asking for the end of all surgeries on children, just the non-medically necessary ones. If a child is born without a urethra, that is a medical emergency and it needs intervention. But if we're talking about the shape of their genitals looking strange, say they have hypospadias, and rather than the meatus being at the tip of the penis, the actually opening for urine is at the base of the penis. So more in what's called the female position. So people will try to reroute that urethra through the penis, and those surgeries have caused so much harm to a number of intersex people. Now, some people don't want to count hypospadias as intersex, and there's lots of ways that conversation about what counts as intersex and what doesn't. But in the community, we have intersex people who've had these surgeries, and they require multiple surgeries as the child grows. You say that children presenting with gender dysphoria eventually desist and are at peace with their God-given bodies. And it's true that some children do desist, or at least their dysphoria becomes manageable. But for those whose dysphoria is persistent, consistent, and insistent, we have ample evidence that their symptoms worsen by going through puberty, a puberty that moves their body farther away from the gender that is their sense of self. And for these kids, we're trying to find out the most compassionate, responsible, evidence-based studies on outcomes. We have years of testimony from intersex adults testifying to the harm of early surgical interventions. They point out that you don't operate on a child in order to allay the fears of a parent. And they are slowly changing some of the protocols for that. We have ample evidence for those who transition as adults using surgery and hormones that the satisfaction rate is over 90%. So the big challenge is the adolescent population. I think that's where most people are really scared and wondering what to do. We have some initial studies, but they're 4 or 5 years. Some of those initial studies show very low percentages of regret, but we don't have the long-term studies yet. We're in the middle of the science and trying to figure out what is going to make things worse. We tried psychology. Let's see if we can change the mind to fit the body. And we learned that that didn't work. We've tried various protocols, which are being revised as we find out, okay, those protocols aren't the best. Donna Strickland at the conference said in her plenary lecture how frustrated the public was about scientific studies on COVID and the conflicting information. Which study do we trust? And she said the public doesn't understand the scientific process. Hypothesis, testing, revision. Hypothesis, testing, revision. And like COVID, people can hear anecdotal stories which feed fear and make it difficult for them to accept scientific studies. I have a friend whose friend died of an allergic reaction to a COVID vaccine. And it didn't matter how many scientific studies showed the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Nothing was going to overturn her experience of knowing someone who died from it. We know that medical interventions, many, as you mentioned, iatrogenic harm, they carry risks, which is why doctors are under obligation to spell out those risks and the potential benefits. And this is what intersex and trans people and their families are asking, to let them learn what the risks are and make decisions for themselves rather than having it legislated by politicians. Again, playing on fear to advance their political careers, frankly, is my perspective on that. So that's my best answer to that question.
Okay, very good.
Thank you for asking it.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to another question from David Yee. Yeah, I see you there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, and thank you so much for your lecture, Megan. I hope I'm not out of line by putting in a plug for your alma mater, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, because my son also went to that seminary. My question, your lecture, I think for me, overlaps that of Tony Josma some months ago. And it made me wonder if we know or have any idea what percentage of intersex individuals suffer from gender dysphoria.
Such an important question. My short answer is no, we don't know yet. In my lecture, I mentioned a detailed study done by Intersex Human Rights Australia, which showed us that 52% of intersex people identify as non-heterosexual and 48% identify as heterosexual, but they didn't have questions about gender dysphoria or transgender identity. And again, this gets down to the definitions of what counts as intersex and what doesn't. But if you ever come across those numbers, please send them to me. I want to see those studies.
Okay, thank you.
All right, it's tough to do. All right, and now the final question that was submitted in advance comes from Marty Pomeroy. Hello, Marty. Go ahead.
Hey, Randy. Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for volunteering before God to be a lightning rod. That's quite a calling you seem to have. Now, I realize that in 45 minutes you didn't have time to address everything, but I think when you're, as a Christian, you know, we wrestle with the science and the morality issues. And so my question was, the reality is that humans have always been creative in their depraved sexual expressions, and that's the primary root of standard Christian concerns. Our culture tries to press in on us to accept everything. And I had a separate question in the forum about postmodernism, which I think underlies a lot of that. But you address the rare medical end, and I recognize the struggle that your video, the Leanne in your video had. And that's very important to acknowledge and to try and support somebody through that sort of thing. But there's just a lot of human brokenness. And where do you stand on human brokenness, how that impacts this discussion? Are there any boundaries for you along that spectrum? And can people be sincere in same-sex attractions, but actually be broken in that regard? What do you think?
Well, the question of fall and brokenness is very important, and of course, something that we need to talk about theologically and scripturally. So I thank you for bringing that up. Again, there wasn't enough time in my presentation to be able to go into detail on all of that. The question of the fall and brokenness is tricky, though. And we've gotten it wrong a lot of times in Christian history and harmed a lot of people on account of it. Left-handedness used to be considered a sign of the fall, a bad omen. The Latin word for left is sinistra, from which we get the English sinister, and the word for right is right. We see the superiority of the right hand in the Bible. It's the right hand of the Lord and sitting at God's right hand in heaven. And my father-in-law was smacked with a ruler on his left hand through his parochial education anytime he tried to pick up his pencil with his left hand. Christians and humans in general have a terrible track record of passing judgments on minority experiences or atypical bodies. We've done this with many kinds of disabilities. There's a lot in the ancient fathers about people with twisted feet and how that's a sign of the devil. In recent decades, we've been helped significantly by disability theologians who are wrestling with the questions of brokenness and the fall from their own vantage point in these bodies that have been declared broken for so long by able-bodied humans. There's some theologians who are deaf who say in the resurrection, I'm still going to be deaf because that's who I am, but I'm going to be worshiping at the throne with sign language. There are other people who are deaf who are like, yeah, I'm ready to hear. So there's discussion within these communities. And let's see what else I had there. And there are intersex people who see their bodies as signs of the fall and believe they will no longer be intersex in heaven. And others say that intersex is so much a part of who they are that if they were resurrected in a non-intersex body, it would not be they who are raised from the dead. The latter part of your question about postmodernism, I also wanted to tell you, yes, I have plenty on that. Actually, I have a 50-page chapter in this book, which grew out of my dissertation. It's the history of conversation about gender and sex differences in philosophy and theology, starting in the classical period and moving all the way through to the postmodern period. So I would point you to that chapter to answer the question about postmodernism. And to the question of, are there any boundaries? I think I've answered that already to say, yes, we need to have conversations about sexual ethics. I don't think anything goes. I do think we can sin and harm each other. But I want to have those more nuanced conversations rather than these blanket statements about straight sex being good and gay sex being bad, as if that's all there is to the conversation.
Can you take the last question? Can people be sincere in same-sex attraction but actually be broken in that regard?
There are many people who are sincere in their same-sex attraction, and the question of whether or not they're broken or whether or not is this a part of diversity or is this a deformity somehow? Those are the theological conversations that we're having. And that's why I was honored to be in the Two Views book on homosexuality, where we could have authors from different perspectives address those questions in more detail because they are so important. I'm glad you raised all of those. Thank you.
All right. We haven't had exactly simple yes or no questions here, have we? That's great. Thank you. Okay, so now we'd like to open the discussion to the entire audience. Now, let me just say a word how we do it. You need to go down to the icon that says reactions in your bottom of your screen. If you don't have it, you might have to click on the three dots where it says more, and you'll find reactions over there. When you open that icon, you'll find something that says raise hand. And so our protocol is that I will call upon you as you click on the raised hand. I'm sorry I can't monitor chat at the same time or something. So if you write to me, I won't be able to read it. So just find that icon, put up your hand, and I'll call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. So first of all, I see Luke Jansen. Go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for this great talk, short as it was, Dr. DeFranza. A quick question. I heard in the video, I didn't catch this before, but in the video, this individual identifies as Leanne. She said that some of her cells have a Y chromosome. And I immediately thought, okay, is this what I understand can be what they call a chimera, the opposite of an identical twin? This is an embryo that's split. Sorry, this is two embryos that have fused. And so this individual is, in one sense, is really two people, a male and a female, or at least one male for sure, wrapped up in a single body. And it seems, well, anyway, maybe I should let you talk. Maybe explain what a chimera is. Is this person a chimera? And then I have a question that ties into that.
I can't say for sure what Leanne's final diagnosis is. She's had many over the years, but certainly she's a chimera in that some of her cells have one pattern and some of her cells have another pattern.
And just again, I'm not an expert, but as I understand it, it's not that just a few cells somehow got it. That suggests that at least two embryos, one was a male, fused with at least one of the other embryos. So it's a whole person essentially that's in that body.
Now in that one person's body.
Yeah. And so then I think this no longer becomes a question about sexuality and morality. It's just simple biology. It's two people somehow tied up in a body. It's no more about morality in the area of gender and sexuality as if you had, for example, a Siamese twin. You can't accuse one of identity theft, right? They're two people, or it looks like they're two people, but they're joined. And here we've got two completely different people stuck in a body. And I guess the one of those embryos that was more female is essentially in charge of the head. So speaking for the whole body. So a lot of words to say, this is not about gender. It's not about sexuality. It's about just a biological anomaly.
Yeah. And the challenge of living in a body that has mixed sex characteristics.
Right.
And her story illustrates so well that if we were a society that wasn't bothered by people who we couldn't figure out if they were male and female, folks like Leanne wouldn't have had to be, raped throughout their college experience and harassed, wherever they went, if we were just more comfortable with bodies that we couldn't classify.
Right. Now, the one third follow-up, if I may, on that same question, Randy, is that okay?
Quickly.
I did a quick internet search because I wanted to get some information about chimerism. One of the hits was Britannica.com. I hope it's reputable. And it said that they think the incidence, the prevalence of this chimerism could be as high as 10%. I was shocked. But then it made me wonder if that's partly behind the biology of transgenderism and trans biology.
Mm-hmm. It's very hard to know. We're still... it's hard to test all of the cells in one's body to find out how they are. And certainly you can change sexual anatomy and reproductive anatomy, but no one is going in and changing out the patterns in people's cells. It's just a complicated...
Right.
So there's so much that we don't know that we still need to be studying, which is why I'm glad that you scientists exist in the world.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. David, you got another question? David Yee?
Okay. Yes, it's more of a comment than a question. I hope you don't mind. But first, referring to Luke's question of whether the individual is chimeric or not, it's also possible in the development of the embryo that a cell might have lost the Y chromosome. And so any cells, tissues, etc., that develop from that particular cell will not show the Y chromosome. So it may not be a case of true chimerism, as you mentioned. Just a comment on that.
Well, thank you, because I didn't know that. So I appreciate you clarifying.
Thank you, Dave. All right. So
what I wanted to explain is I'm sure other people also have the experience that people who say are different from what we regard as normal, especially in, say, conservative Christian circles, feel that it may be caused by sin. And so I always refer to the story in the Gospel according to John, where Jesus and his disciples come across a blind man, and his disciples ask, was it his parents or he who sinned that he was born blind? And I feel that this story is applicable to intersex individuals as well. I hope that comment is within the bounds of this discussion.
No, it's great. In this book, which is Understanding Transgender Identities, 4 Views, in which I have a chapter, I talk about the need for Christians to realize that we can't wait on science to tell us what our ethics should be. We need, what is love of neighbor look like for people with gender dysphoria? Like, we have to figure that out, because this population is so highest rates of suicide, homicide, harassment, denied health care, harassed by the police who are supposed to protect them. As Christians, we should be caring about the safety and well-being of our fellow members of the human race who are also children of God. So there's a moral calling for Christians around this conversation, which is much bigger than, is this caused by biology or not? So
amen to that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, David. Paul Lang, good to see you here. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, you know me, but I don't think anyone else does, and Megan does. And I'm really sorry, Megan, I didn't hear your lecture or read your books yet. I'm a urologist, was chairman of the department. My area is prostate cancer, which was mentioned here. But I've been involved in DSD for decades and given many lectures at churches on this, and been in constant contact with the DSD people. That they used to call it disorders in sexual differentiation. Now it's differences, and it's intersex. And, you know, when I first started urology, we were so proud of ourselves because we took these babies, these XY ones particularly, that had perineums that looked female, even though they had a Y chromosome, and we turned them into females, thinking that this was tabula rasa, and if we raised them female, they'd be females. We also did the same thing with coachial exstrophy, where there is no abnormalities in the testosterone, which is what causes the perineum to become male. And if you don't have it, you become female. And but they had a problem in development, so they had terrible bladders and whatever. And we changed those boys into female too. And then, of course, in both groups, we realized at age 20 that a large percentage of them weren't happy because they didn't have the corresponding brain. And now those operations are now malpractice. And so the DSD clinics are overwhelmed, as you know, with all these problems of not only intersex, but also people who have normal external genitalia, etc. But they feel gay, they feel trans, etc. And they're trying to determine which ones are biological, whatever. I still haven't met anyone in a DSD clinic who doesn't believe that a majority of the truly gender identity and sexual preference people, that this is all various differentiations in the effect of androgens on the fetal brain. And that the differences, and that like our faces, we probably have great heterogeneity in both of these things, both gender identity and sexual preference. And but of course, society can only take so many pronouns. And this term that I hadn't actually heard before is neurodiversity. Basically, that all of us are diverse, not only in race, culture, etc., but in this particular thing. And now it's just coming to the fore. But of course, there's many things we don't know, and it's also very controversial.
Yeah.
And these DSD clinics, when they have people that they've determined, and it's complicated, that they are biologically truly what they think they are, and they're trying to get this taken care of because we don't do this operation anymore, and we ever do it on kids anyway.
So Paul, are you coming to a question for Megan?
Okay, the question. So, delaying puberty is the thing. So the question I have for Megan is, I've heard many lectures on the 7 passages in the Bible that now are called clobber passages, and maybe you pointed this out in your lecture. I didn't hear. Where do you stand on these passages in the Bible? Do you think they are unequivocally claiming that this is an abomination, or what?
Yeah, you might explain what clobber passages are first, Megan.
Let's
let Megan do it.
Has these lectures on these 7 passages in the Bible, and they call them the clobber passages that make them feel like they're sinful and degenerate.
Okay, Megan.
Yeah, like in Leviticus, and as I said, like this is a whole nother lecture. So when I started my work in intersex, I drew a very clear line between intersex and any of the other rainbow conversations. And I said, everybody's concerned about this, but can we just bracket that conversation and listen to these voices that we haven't heard from? Of course, that worked for my dissertation and for my first book. And then I've been brought into these other conversations. And I was sure that those passages were straightforward in condemning same-sex relationships. And then I studied them more and I realized these are not as clear. There is a lot of context that we need in order to understand the meaning of some of these passages. Romans 1, in 1 Timothy, and of course the Levitical passages. There's a lot there. And again, I would point you, I can't give that lecture today, but I would encourage you to, see how I unpack that in this book.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Ed, Carlo.
Yes, thank you. I have I think a simple question, and maybe some of the physicians here would be better prepared to answer it. I don't know, but why do we have to identify male or female on a birth certificate? Why can't we just list it intersex and let the children grow and let them be handled by their parents and then discover what the brain is telling the body? Why do we have these interventions immediately at childbirth?
Yeah, so that was actually proposed in Germany, that there could be a third option on a birth certificate. And what we found is that motivated parents even more to pursue early interventions, which is why the intersex community does not advocate for intersex as a third sex on a birth certificate, because they said, we're trying to keep kids safe in the world, and labeling them intersex in their medical records and in the world is not going to keep them safe. But they do recommend looking at the data. What are the particular sex traits of their intersex variation? What do the statistics say about the percentage of those kids who identify as male, the percentage of those kids who identify as female? And now, of course, we have non-binary that they can identify with too. And so they recommend that you have a provisional gender assignment based on the statistics within the particular intersex diagnosis that you have, but hold it loosely. And as the child grows, educate them on, most boys' bodies develop like this, most girls' bodies develop like this, and there are some for whom sex traits are mixed. And you're one of those kids, and it's really important. We want to hear from you how you feel you are, whether you feel like a boy or whether you feel like a girl. So that's what's recommended by the intersex community. I'm happy to have other, as you said, physicians weigh in on that question.
Okay. Thank you very much. Steve.
something a lot lighter. And I don't expect a definitive answer on this, but it's kind of applicable. Are angels sexed? Do angels exist as male and female?
Well, in the Christian tradition, angels have been presented as male. And as I said in the lecture, in iconography, they were often beardless men. So I don't know the answer to that question. I've never seen an angel myself, but that's the best I can do with that one.
Okay, let's move on. Marty?
That was quick. I would just comment that Jesus said, that in response to the Pharisees or whoever it was, that the woman would be in heaven, they would be like the angels who are neither married nor given in marriage. So I don't think we have that kind of gender identity. I thought I would raise my more of a comment about your exegesis of the Old Testament as separating and the New Testament as uniting. I struggled with that a little bit. I mean, I don't want to go through all the details I wrote on the chat and in the forum. The Greek word ecclesia means called out ones. So, I mean, they're separating and uniting all over the place in the Bible. I don't think so, but I think that what you would find is in the church, if you emphasize the deep significance of the image of God, you wouldn't probably have I don't know if you wouldn't have as much of a theological problem with that. And to make it,
I'm happy to address that if you'd like.
Sorry?
I'm happy to address that.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Go ahead.
Okay. We do know that the Hebrew word for holy has to do with separation. And the separation that we have in the Old Covenant, the Hebrew Bible, is separation from Israel, from the Gentiles. And that holiness is following the rules of being a good Jew and not following the ways of the Gentiles. What we have in the New Testament is a different kind of separation. Now we're separating, now instead of separating people by an operation on their genitals, circumcision, we now understand this as circumcision of the heart and the fruits of the Spirit. And we're going to separate ourselves from the world by our behavior as we grow in holiness, as we are conformed to the image of Jesus. So I don't have a simplistic, this Old Testament is about dividing and the New Testament about, but the way those concepts are used is different between the Old and New Testament.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A little bit. I think, if you want to argue for the image of God in all human beings, it's a very sound foundation. Wherever you start or wherever you end up, it's hard to get away from the responsibility we have to treat people with respect.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. One of the other people who was in our documentary, he said that I was the first person in the world to tell him that he too was made in the image of God, because he's heard his whole life that he's nothing but an abomination, not for anything that he's done, but for the way he was born. Mm-hmm. So those experiences of people are real because of how we talk about sex differences in churches. When the Nashville Statement came out by very conservative theologians, the suicide hotline went skyrocketing. So there's one of those hotlines is Trans Lifeline, and I have a friend who worked it the time that Nashville Statement came out. And he said, you could not believe how many intersex and trans people were calling the hotline because they said, my pastor said, you're not okay. My parents said, you're not okay. And so we have to be more careful in how we're having these conversations in church about the way bodies can develop. People are not born abominations. As you said, they're born in the image of God.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. Very good. Let's move on to John Wood. How are you doing?
Very good, Randy. Thank you, Megan. This has really been quite helpful. And as we're talking here, every question, it seems like, comes up. It starts with the other. It starts talking about them, and it just points right back to us, right? Because, and I really appreciate deeply how you're bringing that out, because I mean that's my experience growing up. I mean, why the gospel made sense to me, because it was really talking about what I need to do to clean up my act, not so much what they need to do. And then it's just remarkable when you look historically about how we get it wrong so often. And I guess the humility factor here and trying to figure out how to do that. So, I mean, there's so many different examples. You're there in Beverly, not just up the street from Salem. And on Finding Our Roots, they had he had a woman on whose great grandmother was hung there because she was a witch and perceived to be. And I think, oh, just the violence we do to one another, and we're doing it again. So tell us, this is what I want you to do, is tell us what we should do here. I love the film and the clips. Are these kinds, is that a way to start? Would that be a way to, because we've had these kind of difficult conversations in our church among the elders and the deacons. It hasn't gone out to the whole congregation. There's some practical things that we could do. Most of us here are trained in the sciences and at some level. What would you suggest?
Well, when I started going to Christian conferences and churches talking about intersex, I'm a decent lecturer. I'm not a, speechwriter or anything like that. But I found that when Leanne found me when I was writing my dissertation, and we became friends. And then we started lecturing together. If there's a recorded lecture at Calvin College where you'll see both of us there, and she shares her story first to humanize the conversation and help people understand the complexity here. And then I help people understand the science, and then the scriptural passages, which I shared with you at the conference. And people were so much more receptive after hearing her story and seeing her in front of them. And that was my inspiration for creating the documentary. I said, Leanne, I want to take you to every single church in the United States. And that is not possible. Like, we need to record your story. And then what we ended up doing was creating an 80-minute, feature-length documentary, which has hers and other stories, people from different Christian denominations with different intersex variations, talking about what their lives are like. And we created it for churches as conversation starters. It is the fastest way to help somebody understand what on earth are you talking about? Because mostly their minds go, what? Yeah. So that's why we made the documentary, to make it as easy as possible to introduce this complexity. And as we were making the film and I was doing these interviews, Leanne and I also wanted to make a curriculum for churches. And so I asked additional questions beyond things that went in the film toward the church. And so I have created a 6-part video curriculum with a written leader's guide, which actually breaks up the documentary into short segments. So you'll hear a story, you'll learn a little bit, and there are discussion questions. You'll hear, then the next week, and it also has instructions on how do we facilitate conversations in the church around content that is just so viscerally charged. So it also teaches folks how to have that conversation. So you can find all of those things on our website, the links to find the documentary and the Bible study curriculum that we created for that very purpose. Because I think hearing these stories unlocks something in people and say, I always wanted to ask this question, but I never really felt like I could or I had permission to. And now they feel like they have permission to at least ask questions that they didn't feel like they could ask before.
Yeah,
very helpful. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me take this opportunity then to just comment about the documentary. So Those of you who heard the lecture or listened to the recording of it, the beginning of that lecture had a 2-minute trailer of the full documentary, which, as Megan pointed out, is an 80-minute full documentary. And I just want to say that we are in discussions with Megan about how best to make that documentary more readily available to all members. And we're close to figuring that out in one way or another. But we want you to be able to access it and be able to see the entire documentary. Obviously, at 80 minutes, we couldn't incorporate it either in the plenary talk or in this program.
Though I asked about it. I asked if we could screen it there.
Yes,
Can we please do the documentary before I give my talk? And they said, there's just not enough time.
It was a little bit tough over there, but you did ask. You tried to get it in, but we'll get it in another way. So, Ken Wolgemuth, how are you? Good to see you. Take your turn.
That's fine. Is her talk from the meeting posted yet to be able to watch again? Number two.
I'm sorry, it is not a public lecture. It is available to ASA members only.
That's what I mean. From the meeting that the Toronto meeting.
Yeah, it's available for ASA members only.
Yeah. Okay. And then, what's biological organs does Leanne have in all this context? And kind of why was she bullied? Could she ever have children, or what are some of those issues?
Well, she said herself in that video that at 22, she had the sex development of a preteen boy.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I missed hearing that. Yeah. Okay. Wow.
But she couldn't function socially in the world as a boy or a man.
As a boy.
And so
okay.
chose to undergo the 3-step surgery process that she talked about in order to live as a woman. And behold, the bullying stopped.
Curious. Okay. So, John, are you having your hand up again, or
yes,
you got a leftover? You have one more thing. All right, go ahead.
So, Megan, I just wanted to say, and Ken's question really brings this forward. As an instructor, my colleague next door had a young lady in the first year as her advisor, and I had him as my advisee in the second year. And then he graduated and was married to a young man who was also in our program. And we had, there's just very little guidance on how to do this as you go through. There's just not much conversation. And so this conversation, it seems to me, is just really vital, just to give guidance. I don't know how most people feel, but it's just very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And
we all have this sense of our own gender, and we have the sense of how we view the world. And so it can feel very personally uncomfortable.
It sure does. And then if you're thrown into a leadership position, you just feel like you're at sea here. So I just once again want to say I think on many of these science faith questions, it is having theologians step forward and engage. My experience over the years is one of my theologians buddies says to me, he said, "John, you know way more about theology than I know about science." I think, yeah, and it's not easy. Okay. But it's like we really need to encourage one another to jump into these conversations. And so thank you for doing it so well. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Kind of you to say.
Okay. That's great. All right. Any other comments? Anyone else have a question here? I guess I would say, Megan, that I find it fascinating and helpful that we're learning more about the biological bases of uncertainty in gender. But it also seems to me that as complex as the body is, we still don't know how to detect everything. There are many aspects which aren't just simple DNA problems. and the way in which expression happens and the different factors in it. So there seems to be no complete way that we know yet that we feel that any tendencies or identity feelings that people have, to what extent they have a biological component and how it all works. I don't know. I guess just an open field, isn't it?
Well, like I said, we're in the middle of the science, but we can't wait for science to teach us how to be kind to people and love people and protect people from bullying. I have a friend who's a transgender woman who's a pastor, and she has death threats. There was a man putting her face up on a Facebook page and saying, if you see her, shoot her. I have many other intersex friends who have death threats against them. I mean, the rhetoric in our country has become so, no, it's this, no, it's this. Nobody's talking to each other. They're just firing back and forth. And people are being harmed.
Right.
And we have to care about that as Christians. We are called to care for the vulnerable. Right. So how can we change the way we're talking about this and have some humility and forefront how Jesus wants us to treat other humans?
Yeah, I agree. And I think all of us, I mean, everyone would unanimously say those kind of death threats and this kind of violence is absolutely off the table. But perhaps we aren't so critical of just the simple judgmental things that far more common, that we pass judgment and make people uncomfortable. And we need to be aware of that as well. That you've brought that up for us. Okay, so we only have a few more minutes. Marty and Paul have their hands up again. You guys have already had a chance, but no one else beat you to it. So go ahead. A couple of quick questions, Marty.
Yeah, I was hoping maybe you would talk a little bit more. You're touching on the culture wars. And postmodernism is, I think, a primarily underlying a lot of the culture wars, what I would call, you could just, generically say on the left or whatever. How do we deal with that as Christians? I think you would probably hold to something more of philosophical realism. There is an objective reality. Human nature we can be wrong about what we think about ourselves, that what others do to us and the choices that we make can break us in all kinds of different, and does break us. Everybody is broken in various ways. Anyway, but the postmodernism impacts this discussion especially in the culture wars. Can you comment?
Well, with all of your questions, I just think you need to read this and you'll get so much more. You'll get the kind of data that will make sense to you from church history and other theologians. In the first half of the book, so the first chapter is let's learn about intersex. Then the second chapter is focused on the history of the exegesis of Matthew 19:12, and I actually published this before I learned that in rabbinic tradition there were 5 extra categories. I learned that from a subsequent book that I was a part of, from a medical doctor who was researching rabbinic literature, and those 5 extra categories were right there. One of them being the one that Jesus used, and they have, religious tradition going all the way back where they have wrestled with these things. What are their religious obligations? Who can they marry? All of those. And we don't have that in the Christian tradition. Right. And I explain why in the book.
Yeah.
Real quick, can you put the names of those books in the discussion forum?
If you go to my website, megandefranza.com, and click on the author page, you'll find all of those things along with some journal articles. And I would definitely recommend the one that's free that I have a link to in the Reform Journal called Gender is Not a Virtue. Because what I hear a lot of these conversations are, okay, what is good behavior? Where are the lines? And which, I use the language of virtue with that. Right. So I would recommend that. It's very short.
Okay. All right. We've got 3 minutes left. Paul, if you don't mind, since you already asked the question, let me take it from Kirk Birchie because he hasn't said anything yet. All right. Real quick.
So I guess my question is related to the one we just had. I'm a little concerned. It seems like you're taking your cues on what we should do to infants and young people from folks who are in their 20s and 30s in the transgender community today. And I'm concerned that some of their views might be colored by the culture wars we were just talking about and LGBTQ stuff. And how do we know if we make decisions on infants today that 20 years from now, it's not going to be different and they're going to regret what we've done today
or not done?
Or not done. So
we have 50 years of research on surgery on intersex children. These are not folks who are young and a product of the culture wars. We have so much research from this community saying early surgeries are, they cripple the individual, they cause pain, they cause sexual trauma, they are so problematic. Wait on non-medically necessary surgeries that are intended to, they're like plastic surgeries where you can just reshape the genitals so that they look more typical. And these are Christian parents are saying, what do I do? How do I interact with my church? Can I leave my infant in the nursery? What happens if someone changes their diaper? How's that going to go? And I mean, the saddest calls I get are from parents who they did early surgery with the advice of the doctor, raise the child in the gender that the doctor said this is what they're going to be because this is the intersex variation. Now the child identifies not as that gender at the age of 5, knows very early, and they're in a Christian school, Christian kindergarten, Christian first grade. And now the problem is if that child wanted to choose to make their ambiguous genitals look in line with their gender identity, you don't have the tissue to work with. You've taken that choice away from them. Those are some of these parents are they're devastated. They don't know how to talk to the teachers at the school or their pastors, which is why we need so much education.
Right. Well, our time is up, Megan, and I just want to thank you for bringing this very complex issue, and yet highly relevant in our society today, up for discussion. And I want to remind all of our attendees here that we have our discussion forum is open for you all to continue the discussion. And that link has been in the chat somewhere. And you can also find it on the archive page where all the recordings will be posted. We're going to post this as well. And so with that, I would like to thank you and say farewell.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.